College football nerds here talking Alabama and Texas A&M. Going to kind of cover what we saw in week one and then get into this matchup. Remember, as usual, we're back for 2020. Like and subscribe. But also remember, in the comments, give us your score prediction for this game and maybe a little bit of what you thought about Alabama or A&M given all the uncertainty coming into the season. Josh, this game went a lot like we expected. There were a couple of things that we wanted to see coming into this game that we were unsure of. If we're talking about Alabama, we're starting with Alabama. And for me, I think, one, we're going to get into Mac Jones in a little bit. But we felt pretty good about the offense coming into this game. We felt pretty good about Alabama being sharp and ready to play, given how many people they had coming back, both from the coaching staff standpoint and from a personnel standpoint. One question mark we had, and one place where we wanted to see improvement and thought we would see because of so many new old faces that were healthy on the defensive side of the ball. And for me, I was really encouraged by what I saw, given how bad it was to end the season last year. And I want you to unpack a little bit about how the box score or the final score really isn't indicative of this being the brand of Alabama football defensively that we've come to expect versus the brand of Alabama football that we've seen in recent years. Maybe unpack that a little bit as we get into this one.
So it's a theme with both teams, I think. The box scores really, if you look at especially just the scores in general, I don't think they really reflect how the games went. So the Alabama-Missouri game was 35-3 with, 9 minutes left in the third quarter. It really wasn't that close until Alabama, midway through the third quarter, was rotating in their second and third string. And I know, we can talk about that more in a minute. But, I think the most important thing to understand is that when the game was actually kind of in question, not much was really happening for Missouri. And even then, when the backups came in, Connor Bazelak played for a good bit. He had 4.9 yards per attempt. Roundtree was effective in the second half, but still averaged under 5 yards per carry for Missouri. And, I think overall when Alabama wanted to, really assert themselves early in the game, they were able to do it. And in particular, I think, I want to say Christian Barmore didn't really play for Alabama in this game. So, they're already out one starting DN who has a minor injury and it was speculative whether he would play, but I never saw him. Instead, you got LeBron Ray and DJ Dale, who missed pretty much the whole end of the season last year for Alabama, and then a freshman that was a terror in Will Anderson on the front. When those guys were in the game, particularly those three, I never really saw Missouri do much of anything offensively. It looked, I won't say it was quite on brand with how Alabama had been way in the past, but at least for the past couple years with the struggles they had, I didn't really see it. I thought when Alabama starters were in and they were trying, they pretty much were stoning Missouri. They were stoning Missouri with a pretty good athlete and quarterback in Sean Robinson. It was it looks like it's going to be a functional offense for them this year. And I think the quarterback situation is a lot better than they had last year with Kelly Bryant. Some of the plays Missouri did get off had more to do with their athletes than anything Alabama was doing wrong. I didn't really have any real issue with it. And again, knowing that in the third quarter when Missouri finally actually put more than 3 points on the board, that it came with what was effectively a third string defensive end in, because Alabama already started a second string DN. That doesn't bother me so much. And, one touchdown came on a true freshman backup player at linebacker blowing a coverage and giving a TD to a running back out of the backfield. That doesn't really bother me for the future. And that, more importantly, I think when you're doing a preview, the 35-3 score is what matters for Texas A&M, because A&M's not going to really see the backups that gave up points to Missouri.
Yeah, and I think people need to also understand, and this is something that we've talked about so much on this show, y'all, Nick Saban absolutely does not care what the final score is as long as his team wins. He doesn't care about style points. He wants all of his players to get in reps, and he wants all those teaching moments, and that's been harped on so much through Saban's tenure. Alabama fans also need to understand this is a far better offense. Well, let me ask you, do you think this is a better offense than the one that scored 48 points, granted 2 touchdowns defensively, against Alabama last year in the Iron Bowl?
I would say absolutely. I think Missouri, one game in, I still think they're a better offense than what Alabama faced last year in Auburn. And I'll pull up right now as I'm talking, buy a little time. So total offense in 2019, um, Missouri was 11th in the conference. Auburn was 10th. Missouri was 5.27 yards per play. I think Missouri is probably better offensively than they were last year. I think Robinson's going to end up being a better quarterback than they were. But it was effectively last year the same offense that put up that many points on them in the Iron Bowl.
Yeah, and with a running back that's no longer on the team for Auburn, Roundtree, on the other hand, is going to be probably a day 2 pick in the NFL, which says a lot for a running back. And Robinson, maybe not an NFL quarterback, but very talented, very athletic, and the kind of guy that can keep a drive going more so than what Nix was doing last year. So I was encouraged with what I saw defensively, especially given that I've seen so many not typical Alabama games in the past from this Alabama defense. So it was nice to see them get back to that. I want you, before we talk about Alabama offense, I want you to talk about the Texas A&M game, because we were comparing notes before the game or before this discussion, and on both of these, kind of like in your open, you said the what we saw in the final score wasn't necessarily indicative of what we saw in the game. And Texas A&M fans might be frustrated about that final score, and a lot of people were piling on Texas A&M today for not blowing out Vanderbilt, though I'll remind everybody that it kind of took the same arc for the first 3 quarters as Georgia and Arkansas. Talk about specifically what happened in that game that really gives us a false indication of how that game went and how those two teams compared.
One of the funny things that happens in football is you have differing numbers of possessions, and turnovers can have a disparate impact depending on the number of possessions. So if you're an underdog in a game, one of the most effective ways to win that game is to shorten it. And people think shortening the game is all about depth, and that's what gets talked about a lot. It is, and it isn't. There's also sort of we talk about variability, and there's this variability factor to it. If you play fewer possessions, maybe I'm going to score 3 possessions in a game if I have 10 drives. Okay. Well, do those 3 scores all come on the first 3 possessions, or do those 3 scores come spread out? If I shorten the game, let's say, you play 10 possessions each, and you score 3 times and they score 5, you win by 2 touchdowns. But in the first 5 possessions, maybe you outscore them, right? How many times do you see, like you're talking about with Arkansas and Georgia, where it's a close game at the half, and then eventually Georgia pulls away? It sometimes it's due to depth, but sometimes it's just sort of law of averages. You can call it settling down, but the better team, eventually that shows on a couple drives in the game, and it's usually enough to put it away. Long story short, here, the story is that there just weren't that many possessions. Texas A&M had 9 half-ending possessions in the game. On those 9 possessions, 4 of the possessions ended in some sort of fumble or turnover. So you effectively had really only 5 non-fumbled possessions in the game, and you scored 3 times on those 5. So the point being, A&M was actually, when they didn't turn the ball over with a real stupid mistake, they were pretty effective. Now, you can say the stupid mistake's a function of the offense, and I get that and respect that. But you need to be clear to differentiate having a bad day and keeping yourself in a game with an inferior opponent to a team that was unable to move the ball or unable to score on a regular basis. Georgia, in their game, it wasn't like it was flukes and fumbles that kept them from scoring. That's the thing that's kind of terrifying watching that game if you're a Georgia fan early, at least until they got the new quarterback in. A&M moved the ball pretty successfully most of the time. They just, didn't hang on to it. So if those fumbles don't happen in the game, if there are more possessions in this game, Texas A&M would have beaten Vanderbilt by a significantly larger score. And in terms of projecting out how the Alabama game will go, the 17-12 score is much more a bad day by Texas A&M than it is an indication that they're close to Vanderbilt in quality.
Yeah, and Alabama fans have seen A&M give Alabama fits and then turn around and almost lose to Arkansas. So it's hard to look at these games and where A&M's probably not up. It's a first, week of a weird season. It's hard to glean much from that, though it's a little concerning still, that score not being able to get things together to not turn the ball over. But like you always say, and we've kind of maintained for a while on this show, fumbles are random and variable. Recovering those fumbles or losing those fumbles is even more random or variable. So to have that happen 4 times in one game is actually pretty rare, and not. I would be far more concerned if we saw 4 interceptions. Though, given how Mond played against Vanderbilt, I'm not so sure. Even though he's had hype follow him around his whole career because he flashes, I'm not so sure he's a better quarterback than what they just faced. Let's talk about the offense for Alabama a little bit. We had some question, of who should start, and not really. I don't think either one of us questioned who should start, but maybe who needs to be the start at the end of the season for Alabama to win a national championship game, because maybe Mac Jones is going to be the guy that can get you there but not get you a win. What I saw Saturday was, overall, it didn't seem too tough for Mac Jones because he had all day to throw in a lot of instances. The Alabama offensive line really dominated, and the run game was going, which is something that Tua didn't always have. I saw him make a few throws that, if I'm an Alabama fan, I'm really encouraged, because they weren't game manager kind of move the chain types of throws. They were multi-level route tree, reads and moving around in the pocket, and the touchdown throw to Waller was pretty incredible. You were more on the fence of show me, prove to me, Mac Jones. So why don't you kind of outlay your thoughts on what you saw? And did he, at least from what you saw Saturday, change your opinion or nudge you in that direction of maybe he's a guy that Alabama can win a national championship with?
So my concern with Mac Jones had been going into this game, he had not been very effective on third down. So in 2019, everybody looks at Mac Jones' final stat line. He's 186 quarterback rating, 69% passer, and he had 14 touchdowns and 3 interceptions. But he was a 258 QB rating guy on first down, 10 touchdowns on first down. And on third down, he was a 97 QB rating guy with 1 touchdown. That was a 77% completion percentage on first down and a 58% on third down. He was actually, I think, 4th in the country on first down QB rating, and he was outside the top 100 on third down. So when we were doing our Alabama preview, I pointed to the fact that I kind of wanted to see how he looked on third down. And I didn't know how much of it was situational, how much of it was kind of nerves, because there were some games he got thrown into the fire, and he only really threw in those games on third down when he really needed to, and he really wasn't ready to play, so he had a lot of bad success that affects his stats. In this game, it's a tiny sample size, but third down QB rating of 326 and 2 touchdowns. He only threw 5 passes on third down, but 68 yards and 2 touchdowns. His 10 passes on first down were 80% completion percentage and 172 rating. But if you want to ask, what's an effective day at the office on third down, you throw 5 passes and 3 of them go for over 15 yards. That's a pretty effective day. So, in terms of answering that question, probably his best game on third down that he's had in his career. It's the only one this season, but I definitely thought he played at a much higher level than I felt like he played, frankly, at any time last year. There were times where he was inconsistent and inaccurate, and I think people maybe overlooked that a little bit. But like some others have said, it's a different style. So you've heard this alluded to, like on game day and such. Alabama built an offense around Tua Tagovailoa and his ability to execute the RPO, and he did that because he had a very quick release. He threw a tight, fast, accurate ball, and he could hit line drive, like slant routes, very quickly and very accurately. That's a hard throw. It's extremely difficult to defend, but it's very, very difficult to execute with timing and the accuracy needed to do it. Mac isn't as good at that throw, but Jones is actually probably more accurate with the deep ball than Tagovailoa is. And the offense is a different scheme with Jones, where they're using more vertical routes, more touch routes over coverage, which Tagovailoa is a lot better with a flat throw than he is trying to drop the ball over. And by leveraging that better, Jones looks like a completely different passer than he did last year, trying to run the scheme that was really built for Tua, not for Mac.
Sark is, I think, at his heart, more of a pro-style coordinator. Do you think, though, because Saban has had a tendency to do this, where early season going into a game, they don't open up or show the full playbook, and they didn't have to Saturday. I'm not saying that they held a lot back, but in your mind, do you think there are any RPO concepts? And people think RPO means you've got to have a super run first quarterback, but it also means just knowing whether or not to give the ball to the running back at the mesh point or pull it and throw a slant. Do you think any of those concepts are still left in the playbook and they're going to showcase them maybe against Texas A&M Saturday should they need them?
I have no doubt that they've maintained those. I mean, Mac Jones has been practicing those plays for a couple years now behind Tua, and you've got an offensive line and a running back that are used to executing them. They didn't show it a ton against Missouri. I mean, there were some elements there. Personally, I doubt that they're ever going to really lean on it this year. And those concepts, because they're read based and because they're timing based, they have to be practiced really heavily to be executed at a high level. I doubt Alabama is just going to suddenly turn around and become an RPO team this year. And I'll tell you what I did see, like, and you mentioned this, that offensive line dominated at times early in the game. And there were a couple points, yeah, and it, they had gaping holes where there's one point where they were backed up. It was really early in the game, and they had the ball on like the 5 or 10 yard line, and it was obvious they were just going to try to run it out of the end zone. They lined up and just carved a hole for like 8 yards, just right up the middle, and I was kind of impressed. And then there were a couple other times later in the game where they did similar things, where you could tell they really wanted to run it to like punch a score in. And they were able to do it pretty much at will. I think you're going to see Alabama be a much more power-based team, more pulling linemen. They've got depth, I think, on the interior of the line, and they've got a good line all around. And they've got a transfer, a tight end from North Carolina that's supposed to be pretty good. So they've got somebody as a flex player that they can use as a lead blocker. So, but when you factor all that in, I think Alabama's going to be much more a power team. There'll be some RPO elements. They've practiced them before, but those things it's like running the zone read. I mean, if you're going to really be RPO or zone read, you have to do RPO and zone read because you need to spend a lot of reps practicing it. And if you're practicing that, you're not practicing something else. I think it's going to be a much smaller part of the offense, something they use because it's still very effective. But like you said, you can do the RPO with like bubble screen concepts. You can do the RPO with simpler read concepts to keep a defense honest in the run game. But every time you do the RPO, the RPO does not let your offensive line get downfield and block because they have to be able to pass protect without having a lineman downfield. They want to let those linemen roll. I don't think you're going to see the RPO as a really significant portion of their offense this year.
And one more thing before we get into more of this matchup, just because I think it's pretty interesting. In your opinion, do you think the heavy focus on the RPO and how the offensive line has to condition itself mentally and how it has to block had a negative impact on the running game that maybe Alabama fans are used to seeing?
I think in the past couple of years, especially early in the season, it's negatively impacted them. They were running the RPO because it's hard to have a physical mentality when the alignment aren't allowed to really engage. And then later in the season, when they would get sort of in sync with it, they got better. And I think one of the notable things, maybe wasn't paying attention, but I bet even in the bowl game, they had a lot more power concepts. I know that when Mac Jones came in. And like Auburn in the Michigan game, they ran the ball a lot more effectively. And I think I don't know if it's just scheme or self-scouting, but I think they're going to be a lot more. I think they may be more like mentally or emotionally like ready to play or ready to go because of this and because they're let loose. I've heard that a lot, and I'm kind of, I know I'm kind of stumbling over it, but I've heard a lot with offensive linemen that they don't always feel comfortable running the RPO and they feel a little bit constrained. And I think they'll be able to set more of a tone just by being able to execute standard plays and not having to play the whole game on their heels in pass pro.
So one of the things I want to talk about, and we do kind of want to wind this up because we've found that 15, 20 minutes is our sweet spot. If you're A&M, given what you saw with your own team Saturday, where you were good, where you were bad, and given what you saw on the tape with Alabama versus Missouri, on paper this isn't a close game, and our picks probably are going to reflect that. But if you were going to approach this and where you think you could see A&M having some success, I'm imagining one of those things is going to be to do what Vanderbilt did to A&M, and that's drastically shorten the game, especially with Mond. Maybe let him run a little more to get some, just move the chains, get some first downs, keep your defense off the field, shorten the game, snap it at 3 seconds every time. One, is that one of the things that you would do? Absolutely. And two, if it is, give me one more thing that you think A&M should do that could potentially yield some success against Alabama.
I think it's probably in A&M's benefit to shorten the game for the reasons you're talking about. The longer this game goes, the more opportunity you have for Alabama to sort of establish what Alabama is. One of the concerns I have looking at matchups in this game is how A&M's corners are going to hold up. So I think coming out of the COVID situation and all the circumstances and the circumstances with, what guys came back and then what guys have opted out, I think it's going to really negatively affect their pass defense. Now with Vanderbilt, it's hard to evaluate how that went. I mean, Vanderbilt didn't have a lot of success passing, 5.2 yards per attempt. But they have an interception in the red zone that's caused by a guy running the wrong route. I mean, Vanderbilt is a bad pass offense, and you kind of get gifted success. They still went 20 of 29, but they're just not talented or good enough to really challenge you. I don't know how to evaluate A&M off that, but I have a feeling that the longer this goes, the more Alabama's ability to bomb away downfield is going to show. So I think you want to keep it short and hope that those haymakers don't come early so you can stay in the game and have an opportunity late. And if I were to say something that they, maybe do want to do, I think if you're A&M, you want to come out firing when you get the ball, and you're a little afraid you go 3 and out. And I know people worry about that, but look, if you slowly grind out a drive, and we saw this, the thing that comes to mind was the 2018 championship with Clemson and Alabama. They had so many sustained drives in that game, but very rarely, very, very rarely scored on them, obviously. And the problem is if you don't, strike fast sometimes in those, then you just wait until you make a mistake. A&M is too inconsistent for them to try to grind out drives. They need explosive plays. And if you are A&M, I think you try to grind out sort of early, get a first down, try to get 1 or 2, and make Alabama rotate. For the reasons we were talking about in the Missouri game, the backups are clearly a step back from the starters, at least right now for Alabama. And if you can get them to rotate, then you need to look for an explosive play. If you try to grind it down the field, honestly, Mond looked worse in the Vanderbilt game than he did to me at any point last season. He was very inaccurate. When he did complete throws, they tended to be behind the receiver. A lot of drops early in the game were due to the fact that the ball wasn't placed very accurately. Vanderbilt, and so I think you want to make sure that you have the ability to score quickly, throw the ball down the field, take shots. Because if you try to make Mond complete 4 third down conversions in a given series, I just don't think he's going to do it. And I'll make one point before I flip it back to you, okay? And this, in my mind, is kind of what controls this matchup. It's evaluating how A&M did and how Alabama did relative to the teams they played. Because at the end of the day, Missouri, I think, is a much better team than Vanderbilt. Especially when you look at the offenses. Alabama was obviously a lot more effective against Missouri than Texas A&M was against Vanderbilt. But you have to remember, Vanderbilt was easily the worst defense in the SEC last year. In terms of total defense, and we look at yards per play, so we can take tempo out, Missouri was 4th in the SEC. They were only 0.02 yards per play behind Auburn, so they were essentially almost tied with Auburn defensively. They allowed less yards per game than Auburn did. Vanderbilt was 14th in the conference. So I can forgive Alabama for having a hard time against Missouri because that was actually a really good defense and probably will be a really good defense again this year. Even if they lost some guys, they'll still be good. Vanderbilt was atrocious. So if A&M had any consistency, they would have scored a lot, and they should have been able to score explosively and not give themselves an opportunity to fumble the drive away in the 10th play. And that's really what it comes down to me is Alabama looked like an Alabama team against a good opponent. Texas A&M stumbled against a bad opponent in a game where they should have taken 2 to 3 plays to score. And if they had that much trouble and had to grind out enough to cause that many mistakes against Vanderbilt, I think those sorts of mistakes and hurdles is probably just going to get them buried at some point in the game against Alabama.
We can't forget, though, that this is the era of COVID where we have a Kansas State go 38-35 with HBU and then turn around and beat Oklahoma. I mean, that's what we're dealing with this year. We've seen Texas A&M have some quality, though I do think that there's something to Mond not looking as good as he's looked in the past when Rogers and Osmond are gone. Like that's he lost major talent at the wide receiver position, and he's not surrounded with other great talent to kind of supplement that. So I'm not surprised. I do think they're better than what they showed against Vanderbilt. I'm going to go ahead and give my prediction on this. I think I had a couple of questions about Alabama coming into this season, and they were answered in the game Saturday. I think this is a vintage quality Alabama team in a year where most teams are trying to get their act together because of COVID. So they're already usually better than everybody else, and they're that much more better than they would be in a normal year. I know that A&M has given Alabama some fits in the past and made them look silly. And to your point, they haven't done it from playing slow. They haven't done it from shortening the game. They've done it by taking their shots and scoring some points. They're going to score some points in this game, but I don't think it's going to be close. I'm going to go 41-17 Alabama with one of those touchdowns from Texas A&M coming late. Tell me what you got.
So I'm just going to stick with a score that I already had, which was 41-13 Alabama. We did not tell each other what we were thinking beforehand. I agree with you. I don't think Texas A&M is nearly as bad as the score indicated with the Vanderbilt game, and I think a lot of people are putting them aside because of that. They're not 17-12 versus Vanderbilt bad. It was a weird game, but they're still COVID impacted right now, and they're still figuring themselves out, especially at receiver. I think Alabama looks like they know what they're doing out of the gate. And again, they may get a starting D lineman back they didn't have against Missouri. So yeah, I think Alabama and Clemson, and we're going to have a top 10 preview, but I'm going to say this because it doesn't shock anyone. They're clearly the two best teams in the country right now. We put that out on Twitter. There's a Grand Canyon from them and everyone else. A&M could easily be the second best team in the conference this year. And I don't know if they will, but I'm not putting it past them based off what I really saw especially when I rewatched the game and how things went, and still lose this game to Alabama by 4 touchdowns or more. I will say, I think there's opportunities to score, but when you're leaning on a tight end in Wiedermeyer, no matter how good he is, it's not a good sign that you're leaning on a tight end. Anaya Smith, number 0 for A&M, is a guy that Alabama fans should watch because I think he's an extremely explosive player. I kind of wonder why he didn't play more as a freshman, given how explosive he was in that opener. But they just don't have enough consistent weapons offensively, especially the receiver position, to really threaten Alabama. And I think this one gets out of hand.
We'll say Florida leaned on Kyle Pitts a whole lot Saturday and did quite all right. But I agree with you. That's it, y'all, for Alabama A&M. We are going to do a top 10 video. It's not going to include teams that aren't playing, like Ohio State, who would be right there up at the top, as well as Penn State and Wisconsin. But check that out. We're also going to do an Alabama. Already, we're doing that one right now. We're going to do an Auburn and Georgia preview as well, so keep an eye out for that this week. We are so glad to be back talking about college football. And now we're actually talking about things that have happened and not theoretical, so it's been a lot of fun. Thanks so much, y'all. Have a great week. God bless.